Here. Welcome to the League of Women Voters, Voter Houston's new discussion series for all. We're so excited that you're here for this first one. We know it's going to be a really fascinating, informative conversation on voting rights tonight. I can't wait for you all to hear from the panelists. I myself am really excited to hear and learn from them. We'll be talking about, or they will be talking about, legislation that we may be seeing this year and how we can all advocate to protect fair and accessible elections. I also want to say that we'll be hosting these For All events for LWV Houston members every quarter, starting on April 13th. So this is a bit of a special event where we opened it up to anyone and everyone, but we will start doing these in April quarterly basis for members. We're glad to have you here if you are not a member, and we hope that you'll be inspired tonight to become one. As you may know, the League of Women Voters Texas and LWV Houston vote on a slate of priority issues each year. And in 2021, we're going all in on two really critical and timely issues. Those are voting rights and redistricting. We'll be digging into redistricting at the next event in April, but tonight we are going to dig deep into voting rights. And I mentioned that it's timely, and it is very timely. There is legislation that is happening right now that you can make a difference in, and we will hear more about that in a second. We also believe that it's important to share this information far and wide, and that our job, all of our jobs, will be easier in protecting voting rights if we are spreading that. So encourage you to tweet or post on Instagram or Facebook, wherever you are tonight, with the things you hear, tagging LWV Houston and hashtagging voting rights for all. And we will have a team kind of reposting that along the way too. I'm going to turn this over to Gracie Garces in a moment, but it's really my pleasure to introduce her. Gracie is a dedicated public servant who has prioritized the progress of communities across the state for more than 2 decades. Her work as a public affairs professional in both public and nonprofit sectors puts her at the forefront of numerous Houston community empowerment initiatives. Gracie currently serves as Director of Partnerships at Baker Ripley in the Strategy and Innovation Division, where she cultivates and leverages partnerships to complement the mission and vision of the organization. She also serves her community as a Houston Action Steering Community member, and served as the recent co-chair of the Harris-Houston Census Complete Count Community Subcommittee. That is a mouthful, Gracie. I don't know if you could repeat that 5 times, but I could not. And we are really lucky to have Gracie as a board member with LWV Houston, and she also serves as our secretary. So Gracie, I will turn it over to you.
It is a mouthful, Courtney, and kudos to you because I don't really say it often. But thank you so much, Courtney, and welcome to everyone who's joining us this evening. I am super excited about this very important discussion with what I think and what I believe is an amazing panel. Each of these ladies rolls up their sleeves and fights for voting rights every single day. I've worked with them on different platforms, including Houston in Action, which is a leading organization that is bringing collaborative work to the face of civic engagement. We are joined by Angie Rasso, Christina Sanders, and Mimi Marziani. Angie is the Texas State Director of Mi Familia Vota. In her role, she oversees the state's operations to increase political representation and power for the Latinx community. Christina is an adjunct professor of political science, a commentator, author, voting rights expert, and one of America's youngest civic engagement leaders. Mimi is the president of the Texas Civil Rights Project. She has litigated election law cases before the U.S. Supreme Court, led the first coordinated statewide voter protection program in Texas, and has an extensive background in civil rights advocacy. We only have an hour, and we definitely want to carve out some time to give those tuning in from home an opportunity to ask your questions as well. So for those of you tuning in, please share your questions in the Q&A and we will get to them after our initial round of questions. All right, so let's jump right in. To center ourselves in the issue, I'd like to know how each of you, Angie, Christina, and Mimi, would describe the current state of voting rights. We can start with Angie and then we can just do a round robin.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Gracie, for that introduction. Thank you, League of Women Voters, for the invitation and for all of our audience members that are tuning in today. I would say our current state of voting rights is a system that has spent the past decades crafting a system and platforms to suppress certain communities. They've been very intentional about barring certain communities from participating and doing it very strategically in a way that we think voting is easy, right? Registering to vote should be easy. I did it, so you can too. And really eliminating our community stories and experiences and how we have made it so hard for them to participate. But I'm very hopeful that this legislative session and those to come will allow us to bring forward new initiatives that expand access to democracy. For me, I envision a state of voting rights where we are not punished or criminalized for trying to participate. We see that we're often scapegoated when we try to participate, and policies are intentionally passed. So we are punished when we messed up or we create an error. And also one that welcomes our new voters and recognizes the diversity of our new voters, right? I was once a new voter. I was the first person in my family to vote. And so I didn't feel like I was welcomed in the space. I had a hard time navigating the system, but that's just mean. We have people that are naturalized citizens, right? And they're older. And so they've been in this country and they've seen democracy at the sidelines and now they want to participate. We have folks that maybe registered to vote 30 years ago, but felt like they were not welcomed in the political landscape. And so now this past election, upcoming elections, they want to take advantage of the opportunity. So how are we creating a system for our new voters and keeping those who already registered to vote once upon a time engaged and feel like democracy is inviting them to come back in and to participate as a voter, as someone who is working the polls, as election judges. And so that's really how we envision the future for voting rights, where we see our community participating and actually what Texas looks like, we will see that in election participation.
Awesome. Mimi or Christina, do y'all want to chime in based on what in your expert opinion and what you're seeing? Like, what is the current state? Anything additional that you'd like to add to that?
Yes. First, thank you for hosting this conversation, first with women, which is, I think, extremely important to the whole process, including voting and the communities that we serve. But the voting rights it's absolutely under attack. I know you guys have been hearing that cliche, but it's on life support right now. I don't know what the state of voting rights is right now because the Brennan Center just put out a report that said that over 43 states have legislators that are entertaining over 250 voter suppression styled bills on the heels of an election that turned out more people of color, more women, diverse populations, young people in a way that was incredible during a pandemic. And so I think the restoration of the Voting Rights Act is going to be key to giving some energy and some life to democracy itself, because if legislators can just go in and do what they want as they are, and they have been doing, as Texas itself is threatening to do to us, then they're not making voting laws that are on the side of making voting easier and making voting better. So the state of voting in Texas, it's under attack and it's in jeopardy. And when voting is in jeopardy, democracy itself is in jeopardy. And so we just, see, even I'll just give the quick example of Harris County recently, when, in this pandemic, there were efforts to try to make voting easier, more accessible. Our own state fought against us and went to the Supreme Court to make sure that everyone can have access to vote by mail during the pandemic. And so those things lead me to believe that it's very much in a state of disarray and it needs a lot of attention right now.
Thank you. Mimi, anything you'd like to add to that? I mean, y'all have done it. Angie and Christina are really much nailing it on the head.
Oh, I mean, first, again, let me echo, honored to be here, really honored to share the screen, the virtual stage with Angie, Christina, and Gracie, all of whom I've also had the pleasure of working with in a variety of different contexts. I agree with what Angie and Christina said. All I'll add is a little bit of historical context. The 2000 election between Bush and Gore, one thing that was, I think, overlooked at the time was the extent to which election administration decisions ended up dictating whose vote was able to count. And ultimately, there's, I teach an entire class on Bush v. Gore, but I will sum it up by saying that it was a big, fat disaster. And there were a wide number of people who were not able to cast a ballot that counts. Very unfortunately, there were a number of political operatives that took from that experience this idea that if you manipulate the rules, you can actually rig the game. And I think that we've seen this movement over the last 20 years that has picked up speed at kind of critical junctures. It got some help from the Supreme Court, including in 2008 with the photo ID decision, and then famously or infamously in 2013, striking down the Voting Rights Act. Along the way, as Christina had noted, I mean, we had massive turnout in 2020, but 2008, I think, was also a moment where you had, with the historic election of Barack Obama, you also had Black voters, people of color, young voters, women in particular, turning out for the first time. And so we've had this push and pull between an electorate that's starting to look very different than what it's like historically, and happily starting to look like America. And then this realization that you could rig the rules to determine who are the winners and losers out of that electorate. And so I think then we saw in 2011, I was actually working at the Brennan Center at the time, and we saw what we thought then was an unprecedented number of bills trying to make voter registration and voting more difficult. But unfortunately, I think Christina's right that we might break that record right now. And so, I, like Angie, I have some hope. I think that what you're seeing, the turnout, the increased activism, it is a growing recognition that voting is important, that our democracy is actually pretty fragile, but it is being hit with this very deliberate attempt to turn back the clock on what our American democracy looks like. And right now, it's not clear which of those forces is going to prevail, but that is, of course, why it is so important that all of us are together tonight to figure out how we can do our part to strengthen our democracy.
Yeah, so as you all know, and I'll emphasize this along the way a few times, but the League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization. I'm really curious, in your experience, why do you think voting rights are perceived as a partisan issue? And what can our local league members and community members do to help reframe that narrative so that we're progressing voting rights versus suppressing them? And we can start with Christina.
Well, the partisan nature, it goes just back to the two-party system in terms of how people are voting based upon how their families voted, based upon, not completely, but for the most part. There are a lot of people who still vote traditionally because they feel a certain party offers an option. I think one of the things that not just the league, but organizations can do, especially in states like Texas, is begin to move the conversation through civic education and the conversations we have about representation. Constitutionally in Texas, constitutionally at the United States or the federal level, representatives represent people. And we've got to get it clear to everyone, including the representatives, including not electing representatives that don't get this. You can run with the party, but you represent an entire state, or you represent an entire district, a constituency. And that, I think, is the challenge, is that especially if you live in a state that's polarized, whether people consider it red or blue, and you may have a different value system, or you may have different ideas, the openness and the ideas of our elected officials are very important in electing people and teaching or helping community members to understand, one, to be open and to just really think about what you want, what the future, has in store for you, if climate change is real, because it absolutely is real. And I think getting people to think about what the details of what a party stands for, but separate that from the election to making sure that representatives are advocating for every single constituent in their district and holding them accountable, and only electing Republicans or Democrats who are willing to be representatives for their districts. And I know that sounds way more simple than it is, but I think it's a very difficult question, but I think it's something that we've got to figure out how to challenge or how to handle, because it is a big deal that you have whole communities who won't even talk to a representative because they represent a certain party, or are willing to overthrow the government because they are wanting to advocate on behalf of a party. That is a democratic problem. That's a problem. And so I think getting people's mindsets to be open to understanding that just because you're this party doesn't mean that you shouldn't, you should not be able to have access to resources as everybody else. And I think that that's the disconnect with this really interesting two-party system space.
Yeah, I'm curious, do you all believe, and this is going out to either one of you, that any elected official has gotten that right, what you're speaking about, Christina, where maybe they're elected into a certain party, but when it comes to voting rights, they always go towards promoting and supporting voter rights versus the party's take on it? And this is to either one of you, Mimi or Angie, if you all want to chime in here.
Yes, I mean, unfortunately, it is a relatively, well, for better or for worse, it is a relatively recent phenomenon that the parties have divided themselves into two camps on this exact issue. And so if you look back, I mean, for instance, the Voting Rights Act, the single most successful piece of civil rights legislation we've ever had in this country, has had overwhelming support from Republicans and Democrats along its lifespan. It's reauthorized every so often, and it's been reauthorized by both parties by overwhelming margins. I think that it's also true that when you look across our country's history, that we've had many times also where voting rights have gotten ensnarled in partisan politics because of people's perceptions of, particularly when you start talking about enlarging the electorate, because of the perception of who that's going to benefit politically. And I think that, I agree with Christina that basic civic education is really, really critical. I think there's a whole bunch of work that we should do to stop demonizing have the political parties stop demonizing each other. But I think more broadly, I mean, in Texas here now, one thing I would say to the Republicans who have been in charge and have therefore been taking the lead on making voting and voter registration more difficult, that I personally, TCRP is also nonpartisan. I have worked on one side of the aisle in my past. I don't actually believe that there's some sort of demographic destiny for Texas. Both parties have been competitive in this state's history. And so I don't actually buy into the idea that some people seem to believe that if more people vote, that it's going to necessarily go towards one political party. And there's actually political science research to back that up. And so I think that, whether you're coming at it from kind of a brass knuckles political standpoint, or as you should, as Christina pointed out, from more of a moral and ethical and, putting our country first standpoint, it is just not a good long-term strategy to try to restrict voting and voter registration. It is a much better strategy to continue to improve our democracy, welcome everybody into the process, and then let the best ideas win out in a free and fair election.
If I can jump in, I definitely agree with Mimi and Christina. And Mimi, you said something about, you don't believe that if everyone voted, we would lean one certain way. But I think there's an assumption made of new voters, and particularly voters from communities of color. The amount of times that I've been told, or my team members have been told, no, you can't register voters, that's too political, because we're seen as an organization that's going to register Latino voters, young Latino voters. And, what we see as inspiration, as hopeful for the future, is almost weaponized against us, as in you have an ulterior political motive. And that assumption is put on us when we're trying to center community power. And I think that's why working in coalition is so important, because we have to understand that we want our communities to be empowered, to have the tools, to have the information, so they can make their own decisions about the issues that matter to them and choose the candidates and parties that are going to really speak to their agenda. But it seems like the narrative has been taken over for us and been used against us. And I think, as we're growing our political power, the 2020 elections being a great testament to the great work that everyone is doing, it's an opportunity for us to reshift that narrative back to us and make sure that when people are trying to use that against us, that we have equipped our community members to say, no, I'm not here for a party. I'm here for my community. I'm here for my family. Because when we're doing things so fast, it becomes really easy in the partisan landscape for those parties and for those partisan organizations to say, vote for us, we're going to make your life better. And so we have seen that. And I think as nonpartisan organizations, we just have to see long-term, what is the power that our community needs to have? So we're going to have favorable outcomes for them in the short term, but for the rest of, for the upcoming generations to come.
One last thing for that, Gracie, is, there are some examples, and I'll just say that this would be the moment for us to start planting, or even for the league to start planting those types of seeds. Because if you look back when we've had, at more so the national level, challenges with the civil rights movement, with LBJ, when we think about the Great Depression and FDR, when we think about Jimmy Carter, when we think about where we've had these big changes that started to fold these new populations, not into a party, but into democracy itself, to open up the Constitution, we're actually living in that moment. And so what we do in this moment, even though we're kind of comfortable on our Zoom webinar, but we are living in one of those moments that is going to change the world and our country forever. And the seeds have to be planted right now with those leaders who will do those things that those leaders at the federal level did, and they probably were doing them locally too, but to start to change and move the cities and the states and the policy forward, to leap it quantumly.
Thanks, Christina. And so I do want to talk about the federal level in a little bit, but I want to go to the state first. So as you all know, the League's mission is rooted, right? Our history and our mission is rooted in fighting and pursuing voting rights. Looking at the state, right? Unfortunately, data does show that voting laws in Texas, as y'all have alluded to, are the most restrictive in the country, and that voter turnout is among the lowest. Our Texas state legislature is currently in session, and several legislative bills have been filed related to voting and voting rights. Mimi, will you talk to us a little bit about the state legislation that you and your partners, colleagues, the organization are tracking? Talk a little bit about what bills are uplifting the importance of voting rights and which are suppressing voting rights.
Yes, and I have a little gift for everybody. I hope that you can actually access this, but the Texas Civil Rights Project is working in coalition, whole host, Mi Familia Vota among them, Houston in Action among them, to monitor and try to provide good information about the voting bills that are up. There have been 200 bills filed to date, so I'm not going to go through all of them. What I dropped, if that link works for folks, is a Google Doc that we are keeping up in real time that gives a summary of the state of those bills. Look, I think overall, the trend, as we were talking about before, is towards bills that TCRP disagrees with that would make voting and voter registration more difficult, and specifically we're seeing bills to make voting by mail harder, to criminalize new offenses, to make voter registration rolls easier, to give more power centralized to the Secretary of State, which to Christina's one of her initial points is in direct response to some of the innovations we saw in places like Harris County in 2020. And so all of those bills we are very concerned by and we'll be watching very closely. On the other side, there are some positive developments. We've seen quite a bit of support around bills that would modernize voter registration in one form or another, either to take us all the way to online voter registration or at least to put into law actually the results of a lawsuit that the Texas Civil Rights Project won in the fall that requires voter registration with online driver's license transactions. Also, it's a tragedy that had to happen, but I think there's a silver lining in the COVID pandemic in that I think it's made our entire society more aware of persons with disabilities and people with a variety of health issues. And so we are seeing some bills that would shore up things like curbside voting, which is a really important mechanism to make voting more accessible to people with disabilities. So we'll see. We just started, hearings have just been scheduled. Just started last week. It's a little early to know exactly what is going to move. Overall, we're pretty nervous, but again, there are some bright spots in there.
Follow up to that, Mimi. So I know that the league, we have various members tracking and sharing opportunities to engage. Is there a specific platform or somewhere where where the league might access information on opportunities where people might be able to testify for or against legislation?
Yes, there's several. So one, the league members are active participants in kind of the broad, what's called the Turk Coalition, which meets weekly and tracks all of these bills. In addition, TCRP has been keeping a number of portals to collect information from people who are interested in testifying. And once those opportunities arise, we are committed to pushing it out on our channels through the Turk Coalition. So hopefully that will come out in the leagues. I know all of the local leagues and the state leagues do wonderful job putting out newsletters. It should all be included in that. You can also keep an eye on the Texas Civil Rights Project's social media and website. I will note though, very unfortunately, this legislative session looks different than any other during my 6 years in Texas. Because of the pandemic, there are much more limited opportunities to testify. And so that's something else that TCRP and all of our coalition partners are going to continue to navigate. And I don't know if that's going to open up as more people get vaccinated. But right now, it means that a lot of the opportunities to testify are through short written statements and as opposed to other means.
Got it. Thank you.
Gracie, I'm going to flag another resource. LWV Texas does have a page where they are providing regular updates from Cindy Weatherby, who's the Voting Rights and Election Laws Issues Chair. So I'll post that link in the chat. And there's also there, people can find the Voting Rights Action Paper that the League wrote as well.
Awesome. So now I do want to move over to the federal government. So with every storm, there does come a silver lining. Although the current state of voting rights on a state level are somewhat challenged, there could be hope on the federal level. In 2019, HR 1, commonly known as the For the People Act, was introduced and passed in the U.S. House of Representatives. Among other things, the bill is intended to expand voting rights and limit partisan gerrymandering, redistricting, an issue to be discussed by our For All panel next month. This past Sunday, President Biden signed an executive order to promote voting access and allow all eligible Americans to participate in our democracy. This executive order will leverage the resources of the federal government to increase access to voter registration services and information about voting. Christina, what will this executive order do? Are there still gaps that HR 1 could address? And most importantly, do you believe that HR 1 stands a chance to make it through the US Senate as well?
Oh, that's a lot of questions. One, the act that you're talking about, I'm glad that the president did take that executive order, but that executive order was limited to federal, it was more about federal agencies, which, you know, creatively, there's a lot of space to be able to make sure that wherever resources or agencies are, that they have been instructed to do what they can to register people to vote, to educate people about voting, which includes places like you know, Health and Human Services, the Social Security Administration offices. So there's a lot from that piece of it that creatively can happen. But I think it is a good thing that the president has instructed the agencies to be proactive and engaging people with voting, including the constituencies that they work with. So their employees are included as well. But I think on the other piece, which is the what we need to happen, which is HR 1, you know, I don't know. And I don't know why it shouldn't go straight through the Senate. But there are some things inside of the bill, including, you know, requiring presidents to release tax information that may become a political conversation where some people who aren't interested in expanding voting rights may have a problem with that and consider it controversial and not support it. I don't know what's going to happen with HR 1, but I do think that it could be stronger. There needs to be more guarantees in terms of Voting Rights Act protections for states. And I do appreciate the redistricting piece because the bill is very loaded. So I don't think that it's going to come and states are going to welcome it. I think there's going to be some challenges to a lot of pieces of it, you know, and then also the question is if it will come in time for redistricting, which will be in place for 10 years. There's a lot around HR 1 that needs to be, it should pass because it would be very helpful and get us actually to where we already should be in protecting elections, but it doesn't do enough to create a real infrastructure for voting in the country. And so it does do more to help, you know, from technology to voter registration to upgrading systems, but it doesn't do enough in terms of where people have historically been disenfranchised. And we may see like 254 counties in Texas have 254 different ways of doing voter registration, which makes it very difficult and complicated for people to be able to support other counties and register people to vote, those basic things. So it doesn't do enough for the Voting Rights Act, but I think it does a lot more than what's happening right now, if it were to pass. And I'm absolutely not sure what's going to happen with anything in Washington.
Thanks, Christina. Angie, anything you want to add, or Mimi?
Just really quickly, I agree with Christina. I'm a little concerned about how HR 1 passed through the House, right? How it's the partisanship that we're already seeing. It's concerning, and I think the role that we as nonpartisan organizations have to play in making this a nonpartisan issue, and democracy is for everyone. But I also think any opportunity that we have to expand access to democracy should be seen as, you know, if registering to vote becomes easier for some people, then we as organizations can take advantage of that by giving them more community education and giving them more skills and resources, right? So the more that we can, the easier it becomes for people to register to vote, then they can participate at a greater level, because sometimes people are just struggling to figure out, where do I register to vote? And if it becomes too hard, then they completely opt out, right? And then we may lose them for several elections. So again, good step in the right direction, but there's much more that needs to be done, particularly at the state and local level.
Yeah, I'll just echo. I mean, the voter registration pieces of HR 1 would be transformative. And I mean, broadly, it would put the onus on the state governments to use government data to register people to vote and to maintain the voter rolls, which would be, in a way, I mean, I think going off of what Christina said, we should have already done this. That was kind of the idea behind the National Voter Registration Act in 1993. That's obviously, it's now been almost 30 years. And so in many ways, this is the next logical conclusion that we probably should have already done. I also agree with Christina that it does not have, I don't think the version that passed has the, speaks to the Voting Rights Act that's been in separate legislation. I think one thing that is really challenging in the Senate is, and again, I'm not trying to make a partisan statement, but Mitch McConnell, who is the minority leader, has been an adamant, opponent of voting rights for and campaign finance reform for his entire career. And that does stand in contrast to some really well-known and beloved Republican lawmakers. I mean, John McCain actually is for instance, late John McCain was somebody who was a champion of voting rights and campaign finance reform. But I do think, there's bigger political issues there, but there is a particular roadblock, I think, with Mitch McConnell, who does, I think, have a very strong hold on his party in the Senate and has a long, and I think just unfortunate, very unfortunate track record of opposition in this area. So, I think just going off of, I believe, the only way that it could pass is if there is some sort of change to Senate rules to allow it to be done with a bare minority, which in other words would require that there's some sort of amendment of the filibuster as it acts right now. So that's a pretty steep hill to climb. I personally think that it should be mounted because I do think our democracy is in a very fragile place, and this is the best thing that we could do to supercharge it. But I'm with Christina. It's very unclear how that's all going to play out in these next couple months.
Thank y'all. So I had one other question, but in the interest, I want to be respectful of the folks who are tuning in with us tonight. And so I do want to shoot on over to some of the questions that were put in the chat box. So the first one is, election security and election integrity are the terms often used to promote the bills which restrict voting access. How do we ensure that increases in access to voting will also be secure and ensure that only those eligible to vote are allowed to cast ballots? Angie, do you want to, we can start.
If I can speak from the community perspective, we are still building as a Latinx community, institutionalizing that knowledge about voting rights, right? So we sometimes don't have access to advocate because we don't know the bills that are being, again, weaponized against us. So I think for Mi Familia Vota, we as an organization are spending a lot of time, one, fact checking, and then two, incorporating our community members in that journey, so that when they're hearing this, like offhandedly in the news or in the newspaper, they can recognize, no, that's false. And so I think that is a lot of education that we need to be focusing on right now as we're advocating and as we're preparing for rapid response or long-term strategy, is what is election integrity and who is it for? Because we sometimes skip ahead that conversation. And so I do think fact checking is just so crucial, because that messaging, again, is very, very strategic, but there's so much that goes unsaid and it becomes very believable to people. Because I think everybody agrees that we want to have a strong democracy, but unless we're really unraveling who is saying that and for who and what is their agenda, then people can get confused, or I don't want to say manipulated, but yes, manipulated into believing something that's just not true.
Thank you. Next question. What outreach is being made to establish?
Christina, were you going to add something? I'm sorry to interrupt, but Christina, I thought you were going to add something. I may be wrong.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I was just going to add it to the next round, but yeah, I just want to point that out, though. For that question is really powerful. And what Angie said is real. That is a scare tactic. It is an untruth that has been, that election integrity. They use these words to be able to scare everyone, to make people think there's a problem. There's no problem with election integrity. The only problem with the integrity of Texas elections is that they stop people who are constitutionally have a right to vote from voting and make it difficult for people to vote, that they don't give counties enough money to be able to process elections and go change and close down polling locations because they don't want to fund democracy the way that it should be. That's the integrity that we have. And I think that's something that should be called out more often, so that people, when we're talking to people in the community that get afraid and say, well, we do care about election integrity. Yes, absolutely, we do. But the whole thing about voter fraud, never forget that you're more likely to be struck down by lightning than to find a case of voter fraud. And the cases we find, as we heard last week in committee, in the elections committee, is mostly by elected officials or officials of parties, not by people. People want to vote, and there isn't any evidence of the lack of integrity from officials that are helping people, or people who are from immigrant backgrounds who are now citizens, or from people of color, or people who are poor, or in certain East and West Texas pockets. It just doesn't exist. And so that's why they use those words to scare people to think, to not protect democracy and do things that support those bad bills.
Wait, I agree with both of this, and I'm gonna add something to kind of bring this together. I think with the strand of educating the community, and I think Christina's totally spot on, this idea of this like boogeyman that has been used without evidence to justify bills that just make voting more difficult. I mean, there are a wide number of things that we could be doing right now that actually would make our voting records more accurate. I mean, the number one is that, as we've been talking about, Texas, by and large, does voter registration with pen and paper. That leads to, I mean, I have a kind of a confusing name. My full name is Mimi Murray Digby Marziani. And every time I go, somehow it's like misspelled in my records. And so if I could just go online the way I do with my student loans or my mortgage or anything else and check my records and make sure that it's correct, those sorts of steps of just modernizing and investing in our process actually does make it more accurate and therefore more secure. And so I do think I'd really encourage folks that, I think all of us agree that we want to make sure that we're protecting and investing in our elections. But when people use those terms, I think you should really ask yourself, what is their solution? If the solution to election integrity is to, no longer allow people with disabilities to vote by mail, that doesn't make any sense. I mean, or if the idea is, let's upgrade the voting machines that are in some counties older than people who are voting on them. Okay, that sounds like a good idea to actually invest in our elections. So I think that, having, really being a little skeptical of these terms, but then more importantly, I think just looking at the proposals with a bit of common sense is also going to be really helpful, I think, to beating back some of this misinformation.
Thank y'all. And Courtney, thanks for catching Christina releasing her mute button, because that was a conversation we definitely didn't want to miss. So moving on to the next question. What outreach is being made to establishment organizations like chambers of commerce, the state bar, et cetera, to ask that they go on record with the principle that all eligible people should be able to register and vote, so that a candidate or party has to, quote unquote, sell his or her idea to the most representative population? Anyone want to take a shot at that one? You want me to repeat the question? What outreach is being made to establishment organizations like chambers of commerce, state bars, et cetera, to ask that they go on record with the principle that all eligible people should be able to register and vote, so that a candidate or party has to, quote unquote, sell his or her idea to the most representative population?
Well, I don't.
Yeah, go ahead, Christina.
I don't know who's doing it. I just want to say that's a brilliant idea. And I've seen it done by corporations for the presidential election, but I don't know if there's anyone doing it. I know they talk to the chambers, but I think in terms of voting, I think that's a great idea for someone to to do that, to hold accountability for them.
Yeah, it's not quite, I mean, I agree, that's a brilliant idea. I'll share the Texas Civil Rights Project with a whole host of other organizations bands together and runs a voter protection hotline and trains legal volunteers to be outside the polls. We did some outreach. I'm going to say not enough. I think it's an area we could grow, but we've done some outreach to businesses. And what I dropped in the chat is a statement of values. We asked businesses who wanted to work with us to agree to this, these short values. And it's things like voting is a right and not a privilege. Every eligible voter should be able to cast a ballot free of intimidation. And so I think we got to that a little bit of helping businesses, and there were a variety of them across Texas that wanted to work with us in coalition to really think about what a good democratic platform, small d, democratic platform looks like.
I'm not sure that I'm going to answer the question, but I will say that I've seen a shift in how we talk about voting rights in the past couple of years. And I'm young to the civic space, but when I first started, probably 4 or 5 years ago, people didn't really want to engage in politics. So they didn't really want to talk about registering to vote. They wanted you to do it, but they didn't want to associate or affiliate themselves with that. And I do think in the past couple of years, particularly in 2019 and 2020, we saw a lot of new folks and a lot of really powerful bodies like the chambers, local associations of lawyers coming to us and saying, how can we help you spread resources and information? And so I do think that now people are coming on board saying, everyone should have access to democracy. Everyone has the right to register to vote. But that, particularly from the Latinx community, that's been a trend that's slowly changing because we've seen voting rights just completely under attack and how they've been so targeted at certain communities. And so I'm glad that we have a lot of new folks that are wanting to make those bold stances. And I mean, I think that's great. I think that communication needs to move forward. Again, we had a great results last year, but it just continuously, because if we accomplish something with voting rights this session, I would not be surprised if we completely reverse it in the next session. That's, unfortunately just how things go.
Thanks, Angie. And I think, just talking about the engagement of people at whatever age they're at, whether they can vote now or not. Christina mentioned earlier the benefit of civic classes. And I know Mi Familia Vota and various other organizations have really tried to take advantage of working with school districts to ensure that we are talking to students at a very young age. Would we see, or could we see, improvement in high school curriculum or opportunities for adults, or both? I know one specific league member who would love the idea of engaging in those type of opportunities. What are y'all's thoughts on that? Or what are y'all hearing?
Absolutely. I also think that's very tied to, who is going, right, our state legislators and our state board of education are the ones that are passing that curriculum. So we do need to build that political power. So they are passing culturally competent civic engagement classes and civic classes. That's really emphasizing us building civic culture in our communities. I've used to work with a lot of high school students, and they would say, I have no idea what I learned in civics class. Like, I don't even remember if they taught me what the qualifications to register to vote. So I think we need to analyze what are our current civic classes that our high school students are getting, and then how do we create them in a way that's engaging, but also tie it to real life issues. So they understand that if they are 17 years old, when they're 18, they're gonna be able to vote on behalf of their families, on behalf of their communities, because they're facing real life issues now. And they're just waiting for the opportunity and the resources to make a difference.
Christina, you want to try, and Mimi, anything else? Any other additional thoughts on that one?
Yeah, I think it's just really important we do civics, because democracy, so I founded Politic Engagement Fund, and one of our core things is, similar to the league, is to focus on engaging people, to teach them about how voting translates to public policy, but not just like from a partisan standpoint, but like it's a sidewalk. every adult American should know the process for like getting something at their local level or advocating for the school board. You don't have to be on the school board to know about helping to make sure the school board is doing what it should be doing. And that's the core, I think, that's been gutted out of democracy, or has probably never existed for many populations. So I think getting back to the civics piece, but putting it in schools, there's this number that says, some research that says less than 45% of adult Americans know who their congressional representative and their state representatives are. And it's probably less than that. And I think that that's nobody's fault, but I do think it is a problem when you're trying to manage and run a democracy when people don't know how to hold it accountable, but they're eager to do their part. And I think helping them to do their part and figuring out, getting that information to them early will be key. And I mean, earlier than high school, like as young as we can go, and then just like going through the process of fairness, equity, and a society that we want to live in, so they know how to manage it when it's their turn.
Yeah, I agree with that. And just another thought for everybody watching, I think that this is another really unfortunate ramification of the increased partisan nature of conversations about voting rights. Because really, I mean, we need to insert it into school, we need to insert it into like at all levels. But, I do think there's something to be said for kind of the Robert Putnam bowling alone idea that our society has changed. Like, I still believe people are social creatures. I mean, look at all of us right now. I think that the organizations that we're joining have just changed a lot in recent decades, but that's another place that historically labor unions, churches, these are other places where people would actually talk about how they could make their community better. And I do think that we've lost some of that, and that we need to, like, as a society, insert it, not just in a formal way in our schools, but into a whole host of conversations that we have about our community. And to Christina's point, our role in our community and our responsibility to make our community a better place.
Thank you, Mimi. So one last question before I hand it over to Courtney. So I want to zoom back into the local work, right? So looking at it from the vantage point of the region, former County Clerk Chris Hollins and his team operated an impressive, innovative election last year. They executed strategies to help overcome the systemic barriers that have traditionally suppressed the vote. As a result, an unprecedented 1.44 million ballots were cast. So the strategies, as y'all know, the drive-through and extended hours, 24-hour voting across Harris County. How do we build on the work achieved by the former county clerk to bridge the gaps that suppress the vote until federal and state policies dismantle these systemic barriers? Christina.
Well, first I'm going to say, I think Chris Hollis is amazing. I hope he runs for state office that deals with voting. I don't know if that's going to happen, but I hope he does. But I would also like to just push back a little. I think it was you on this call, Gracie, Angelica, it was Mimi, like your team, like it was literally like the organizations that were on the ground, getting the voters out, doing the calls, calling millions of voters, getting them educated and prepared during the pandemic. But then I think with someone in that office, that's how it begins to complement itself. The civic engagement work, where the government is actually just doing its job and working to be able to we were meeting every week, sometimes twice a week, to be able to figure out, okay, what we need to do to make sure it's safe, and how do we tell people about it's being safe. And I think one thing that has to happen is there has to continuously be that access where representatives, whether they're Democrat or Republican, wherever they are, they're listening to the community groups and they're working with the community groups to help the people in the community. And I think that was the difference. And it allowed for Chris's office to be much more creative, because he even was working with community groups in his team. And I think that was what was different, but also like having some of the audacity to know the policy and to look at other models, being creative and taking those chances. I think that's what has to continue to happen. I think we're in a good position because we do have an election administrator in Harris County that is forward thinking and can hold those things. But I think community groups have to make sure wherever they are to keep pushing to make sure the quality controls and that people and communities aren't left out and they get the access they need.
Yeah, I agree with that totally. I'm going to have to jump, but I was going to share one other thing with the Texas Freedom Network and Move Texas. TCRP has been running a campaign for the last couple of years called Democracy from the Ground Up. There's a bunch of other organizations that are listed on there that have been, including Houston in Action and the League. You know, this is the idea is a blueprint for local officials, and it's actually been incredibly successful because of the ingredients that Christina said, that essentially it's because community groups were going to election officials in a whole host of counties and saying, hey, here are some things that, you know, we've heard from the community that would make voting and voter registration easier. And, you know, I do think that Chris Hollins was, you know, kind of a shining star of an example, but there actually were election officials across the state that were really going above and beyond and being quite creative and innovative in the face of pandemic. And so, you know, I think the overall plug is for, you know, everybody watching this panel has a lot of knowledge in this area. And I would really encourage you to reach out to your local election officials. You know, some of them don't have formal avenues the way that Harris County has set up. They honestly all should, but they all, my guess is that they're going to be pretty receptive. They tend to be pretty small offices. And so I actually think that this is an area where all of us can do a tremendous amount to keep pushing forward better policy on the ground.
Yeah. Mimi, I think if you have to drop, we totally understand, but thank you so much. We appreciate you. Angie, did you have something to add before I hand it over to Courtney?
Really quickly, I definitely, everything that has been just absolutely right. And, you know, to Christina's point, you know, we were all on those calls with Chris Hollins, and we're speaking very highly of him, but I can remember that all of us challenged him and his administration at one point, speaking on behalf of our community, and just, we need these tweaks, we need to be a little bit more creative. And that response, we were always met with a very positive response, right? And I think for me, moving forward, it's proven a couple of things. One, local power matters, and we need to leverage that. We need to leverage the local power that we're building, even though it seems like our state is against us at sometimes. And then two, when we have those great and healthy relationships with our elected officials or appointed officials, then we can really zoom in and take a microscope to some of the issues that sometimes fall between the cracks. For example, you know, we were able to send vote by mail applications to registered voters. Of those who returned them, what was the racial and ethnic breakdown of that? You know, can we zoom in on some of the disparities that we're still seeing? Why are we not seeing proportional voter representation in Harris County? You know, how do we as community groups, what role do we play in doing more community education? So I think huge success that we had in Harris County, and moving forward, we just need to strengthen that community partnership and appointed elected positions.
Awesome. Thank you, ladies, so much. So basically, collaboration really does maximize impact that we can have. I cannot thank you all enough. Thank you so much. It's been my honor to have this discussion with y'all, and I am now going to turn it back over to Courtney.
I'll second that. Thank you so much. I'm really excited. We're recording this and we'll post it later, and I'm really excited to go watch it again, because I feel like there's so many nuggets that I want to hear and really digest. So for everyone else too, or those people who couldn't make it, stay tuned for that. I'm going to share my screen for a couple of little announcements. So first big one is that, you know, knowledge is amazing, but as we're talking about, we've got to put it into action in order to make a difference. So all of the ways that Christina and Angie and Mimi and Gracie talked about tonight, go out and do it and talk about it to your friends and your communities and your coworkers and chambers of commerce. Love that idea that came up. Also, please go to this website at the bottom, and if someone's a board member, if you're on, if you can drop it in the chat, that would be great. This page on LWV Texas's site will lead you to direct action you can take really easily. So you'll see the priority issues are voter registration and vote by mail and fair and open redistricting. All you have to do is click on a button You'll add your address. It'll tell you who your elected officials are in the Texas legislature, and you click send, and it automatically will send that letter. Incredibly easy. If you scroll a little bit further down, you'll see other issues that that the league thinks are important, including issues like climate change. Are you guys able to see the screen? It's telling me maybe it paused. I'm going to keep going, and we're going to hope that you can see it. Okay, so second announcement for tonight, as I mentioned earlier, that we are going to be starting these regular For All events in April for members. The next one will be on redistricting. As I mentioned, it's not too, you don't have to wait for that event to take action. When you go to that LWV Texas page, you'll see information and positions on redistricting. It's going to be kind of messy. I think we can all say it's going to be a really important and interesting process that the more each of us are engaged in, the fairer, I hope, that the process will be. I'll also just say that our hope is that when it is safe and healthy to do so, that these events will become in person. But as that time gets closer, we will poll all of you to see what you think. And then finally, if you are not a member, we would love, love, love to have you join us. The website is lwvhouston.org/membership. And when you become a member of LWV Houston, you also become a member of the Texas and US leagues. So 3 for 1. And you support our work directly on the ground with things like our voters guide and voter registration, programming like this. And we hope that we'll be able to provide more benefits like this event very soon. So thank you, thank you, thank you for all of you who stayed on tonight. I'm really excited to say that we hardly had anyone drop off. People stayed the entire hour. So all that credit goes to Gracie and Angie, Christina and Mimi. Thank you so much. We're grateful for your time and your knowledge. Everyone else, let's go take action and make sure that we're protecting voter rights for all. Thanks, everyone. Have a great evening.
Bye, guys.
Bye, good night. Thank you so much for hosting.
Thank y'all. Bye-bye.